Hello there, my name is Eliza and today I'm going to be talking to you about empaths and highly sensitive people, HSP for short, and how being either or both can affect your physical and mental health. So firstly I'm going to be looking at, is it possible to be both or just one or the other? Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the differences between the two states. And thirdly, I'm going to be looking at how our physical and mental health can be affected by being an empath, a HSP, or both. So that answers the first one really, doesn't it? It's totally possible to be both. I myself am both, and I want to put some links in the description where you can go to free online tests to see whether you meet the criteria for one or both, empath or HSP, or both, yeah. So it's helpful to know this information, I think, because it can potentially make your life so much easier and calmer just by knowing that you are one or the other or both. And by knowing that, you have a deeper understanding of yourself. So secondly, what is an empath? Well, there's not really any standardized definition of what an empath is. But during my research, I found a clinical psychologist called Abdul, based in Australia. Brilliant psychologist. You can look at his videos on YouTube. And so I'm going to be quoting him, basically. So he says there are common psychological features to being an empath. So paraphrasing what he said, basically, he talks about empaths, the different types of empaths you can get, different levels of functioning. Yeah, and it's really fascinating to watch his videos. I'd highly recommend him as being an authority on that topic. So yes, he defines, or it's defined generally as well, that empaths feel someone else's pain. They feel, and not only feel, but absorb the feelings and the pain of others. They're deeply affected by energy and other people around them, both physically and emotionally, which means that they are highly attuned to energy levels, the energy of other people. They often have difficulty in recognizing their own needs because of that, including their own physical needs, especially when they're under stress. They also have a very porous psychic structure, which means that they very easily give into the energy of those around them, and they take on the energy of others as well. So they'd be more sensitive to their environments as a result as well. For example, people can often be very sensitive to mobile phone technology or changing weather, full moon cycles, that kind of thing. Also, they're much more sensitive to predatory type individuals, for example, narcissists or psychopaths. And often this is because they have an overdeveloped inner child energy. And this inner child hasn't learnt how to take in or receive nourishment as a person in order to grow. So basically this means they don't have enough or haven't received enough adult protection. And also that means they have an underdeveloped sense of their adult self. And so they're not able to nurture their adult self as much as a non-empath type person. So for example, this would mean that they would have trouble asserting their own opinion or earning their own status, so to speak, or holding their ground in certain situations, because they would exchange these positive things like asserting yourself, having an opinion or asserting your position. They exchange that and give in to what they think will give them protection or security or acceptance or love. So they kind of have a bit of a bartering thing going on where they would exchange their autonomy or self-assertion for wanting to be protected or loved. So they hope that it will cause a reduction in the conflict by becoming almost like a people pleaser. But this doesn't always work, does it? So, I mean, I personally can relate to this definition very well because I remember trying to earn my parents' love by doing things, by people pleasing basically. So I'd be doing chores around the house or other duties to try and make them love me. But I gave up at around the age of 12 because it just didn't work and I wasn't earning anything. I was just giving in to everything, and what I thought I could earn, I couldn't earn people's affection. So basically yeah, it doesn't really have much of an effect, depending on who or what your family dynamic is. In some cases, it may well work, and so that becomes a reward type behaviour that would be ongoing. So the shift between this dependent and counter-dependent state leads the empath to have a constant state of stress, basically, and stress overload. So empaths, you'd find they're often scared easily and they're jumpy as individuals. You would get also a small group of empaths that are incredibly attuned to their environment, so that they're very frequently feeling overwhelmed by stimuli and have a very difficult time functioning in general. They could suffer physical symptoms such as headaches or disassociation. And also chronic pain, chronic fatigue. But I'll come more onto the disassociation later. I'll describe what that is because that comes under the mental health side of things. So that's empaths. If you relate to any of that, probably you're an empath. So I'd highly recommend go online. I'll put some links below to some online free tests you can do to find out if you're an empath, because it's really helpful to know if you're an empath or not, because it helps a lot of things to fall into place, and then you can develop coping mechanisms as to how to deal with being an empath, how to successfully live happily as an empath. So, secondly, what is a HSP? So that was empaths, HSP. HSP, I'm quoting a Dr. Todd Grande, who is also a psychologist, and he has loads of YouTube videos, so I'd highly recommend him as an authority on this topic. It's very interesting to listen to him and what he says about HSPs, highly sensitive people. And he basically, I'm paraphrasing his statements as well in this section, where or what his thoughts are on HSP, which are, if you do your research, you'll find that it is generalised state, generalised condition, and signs and symptoms of signs and features of being HSP. So yes, it was Dr. Aaron in the 1990s. He discovered this trait, so it was kind of named in the 1990s. Basically, HSPs have a sensory processing sensitivity. So it's not a mental health disorder, but it's perceived to be linked to genetics and also environment as well. So yeah, person's genes, and then how they grew up, what's their nature versus nurture type approach. So the characteristics of a HSP are they are more reactive than non-HSPs to stimuli, for example, lights, flashing lights perhaps, or just bright lights, noise, very high levels of noise, and crowds. They are very good at detecting subtle details. They're very alert, which can become overwhelming, and they often need more sleep, rest, and alone time as well as a result to kind of de-stress from this high sensitivity. They have higher levels of consciousness and awareness as well, and they often have decreased extroversion, which means they're mostly introverted type people, and they process emotions as well on a more deep level. They have more empathy than non-HSP people, and their emotional reactivity, for example, crying, laughing, getting angry, feeling distressed, getting annoyed, is more reactive or more exaggerated than non-HSP people. And there is a percentage of the population which is between 15 and 20% are HSP, it's thought to be said. And there are as well 3 subtypes of HSP type person, so it's not just one whole group of people, it's potentially 3 different groups and possibly more of different levels of it. So I would, if you think you might be HSP, look up Dr. Todd Grande's videos on YouTube and do some research in that area. Also, there's free online tests as well that you can do to find out if you're HSP or not, and I'll put the link in the description below as well for that. So what about empaths and or HSPs and mental and physical illness? This is where it gets interesting, because knowledge is power, and if you know you're one of these groups, then you kind of know what you need to start doing or to do to make your mental and physical health better. So the symptoms, they do overlap a lot. So for example, some of the symptoms for an empath also apply to HSP type people, and as mentioned before, HSPs have more empathy than the general population. So just like the empath, this is where there is a crossover sometimes. It's hard to know, am I this one, am I that one, or the other? But doing your research, you can easily spot whether it's one or both that you are. And so basically, the empathy side of things can lead to dealing to a pressure in dealing with taking on feelings that aren't necessarily their own. I say their own, I should say our own. That applies to me as well. So you kind of take on feelings that aren't your own feelings because you're empathetic, you're picking up what people are feeling around you. And this can be both very burdensome and isolating for empaths and HSPs alike. So this can lead to things like anxiety, depression, overall confusion as to what's happening, what's going on, stress, and why this is happening. So a lot of anxiety there. So basically for the HSPs, it's really key for the person to know whether they're HSP or not, so that they can practice certain techniques to maintain their own self-care and good mental health. And also it's important if they have any health professionals involved in their care, for example, if they have a physical condition or if they have a mental health condition, then it's really important for their health professionals to know that they are HSP so that they can tailor the health of that person in a more effective way. So check out the links to Dr. Grande on the HSP side of things there. And there's also a HSP couple, they're a couple, don't know if they're a married couple, called the Kims. And I really like their videos on YouTube because they are both HSP and they talk so much about coping, dealing with this state, how to cope, how to live your life in a healthy and full way, getting the most out of your life despite being HSP, because it can be seen as a little bit of a handicap almost until you learn how to deal with it. When you learn how to deal with it, then it can become, it's a bit like a blessing in disguise. It's a curse until you know how to handle it. Same for being an empath, I would say myself from my own experience. So under the same umbrella for both HSP and empaths, also there's a term called empathic illness. This is where you manifest the symptoms that aren't actually your own. So say if someone is ill or stressed, suffering from anxiety, you can actually have empathy with them so much that it's as if you're experiencing that illness yourself. So I'm going to quote a doctor, Judith Orloff here. She's also a medical doctor, and she's an empath herself as well. And she found that with her patients, she treats people with these conditions, and they've come into her labelled as lots of different things. So agoraphobic, so unable to go outside, wanting to just stay inside all the time, having various panic disorders, chronic depression, fatigue, pain, mysterious ailments that only partially respond to medications and or psychotherapy. And some of her patients that came into her were housebound or ill for years. So it can be really, really debilitating unless you know how to deal with it. And I can totally relate to this as a person, from the physical side of things to the mental health side of things, a bit of my own background. I was born with eczema, and I had asthma from a very young age and covered head to toe in eczema, most of my childhood and young adult years. I was allergic to absolutely everything except for, it's still today. No, I'm not allergic to anything today, but I'm still allergic to horses. But I was, when I was younger, I was allergic to everything. And I suffered from depression, fatigue, chronic pain, obsessive behaviours most of my life. And it really wasn't very nice. I do believe that, though, being both an empath and a HSP is very related to the conditions that I suffered. So I believe that environment as well impacts you, and this is a massive impact, I think. So it's a big combination of lots of different things. I personally grew up in a very physically and emotionally abusive environment, and so I was constantly on edge all the time. And I coped with this by isolating myself in my bedroom, even though most of the time I shared my bedroom, so I couldn't even have time alone or space alone. And it's very difficult for children to cope with being HSP or being an empath or both, when you're not getting any support at home. Very, very difficult. But when we get older, it's possible to heal this pain, and that's what I want to share with everybody. It's not impossible to heal this pain and to become a thriving empath and a thriving, highly sensitive person. I'm living proof that it's possible, as that's just like a whole world away to my life now and how I live my life and how I'm happy in my life. So I no longer have allergies, like I said, only horses, that remains. And my asthma is gone. I don't use anything for my asthma anymore. And I find that practicing the coping skills that I want to share with you has helped to keep my depression at bay as well. I do think that if you suffer from depression, it's kind of always kind of there, especially if it's from such a young age. But with the coping mechanisms, I do believe you can still live depression-free, mostly. Of course, we always have those down days. I think that's normal. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. What are your experiences? I'd love to know. So yeah, please feel free to share. So I'm going to put the link to Dr. Judith Olaf's website at the bottom as well. And there's a blog on this page and a quick quiz to find out if you're an empath. And she's got loads of solutions there. She has a whole blog on coping and living and thriving as an empath. And also her book. I haven't read it. It's called The Empath's Survival Guide. And it looks really good. I've not read it myself, but it looks really good. So if you're just coming into yourself as an empath and you want to read more about it, I'd recommend that book. Because I think I've read a few pages. It looks really good. So, mental illness and being an empath. This can also come under being a highly sensitive person as well, but I think this next part is more specific to empaths because it's quite progressive mental health issues that I'll discuss now. So the main one, I mentioned disassociation earlier on, and what are the symptoms of that? Symptoms basically would be, I want to say symptoms first. The description of being in a state of disassociation would be that you might forget things, or you might have gaps in your memory. You might think that the world isn't actually real, or that you aren't real. So that can be like a generalized way of just explaining disassociation. So you would have symptoms such as perhaps an out of body experience, feeling like you are a different person sometimes, that you're not yourself, that you're someone else, feeling like your heart is pumping and or lightheaded. You could feel emotionally numb or detached. You could feel little or no pain, have an altered sense of time, not remember how you got somewhere, have tunnel vision, hear voices in your head, have intense flashbacks that feel real, become immobile, as if you just can't move, as if you're just stuck in one spot, and you could get absorbed in a fantasy world that seems real. Now, to myself personally, it mimics a lot of psychotic illnesses. And for example, getting absorbed in a fantasy world that seems real, that's paranoia, extreme paranoia, and even come under delusions. And also feeling emotionally numb or detached, you could go into a catatonic state, what they call in psychology, psychiatry, a catatonic state. Or hearing voices, that's totally linked to schizophrenia. So there is a bit of a crossover. So it's possible for empaths to become misdiagnosed as a schizophrenic or as bipolar or as a manic person. But it could be because they're basically on overload and not able to cope with being an empath. So it's a state that's often linked to those mental health conditions that I mentioned, also bipolar disorders. And so it's really important to know whether you are one or not, because then you know when you're headed down a certain road, you can put a statement on it, almost like a label on it. You think, oh, okay, no, this is a symptom of being an empath. So you learn to understand and know yourself just a lot better. In my next video, I'm going to be talking about coping strategies. What can help to cope with being an empath or a HSP person? And so I'm not going to talk about that now. I'll talk about that in my next video. I'm going to be sharing my own experience, what works for me as being HSP and an empath, what I do to combat, or what I have done and what I practice that really helps me on a day-to-day basis so that I can live as happy and as full a life as possible. So I want to share that with you in my next video. I hope you enjoyed that information there, and I will see you next time, and take care and look after yourself. And thank you for watching. Bye for now.